Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome back for another episode. And I'm absolutely thrilled today because I am in for a treat and you are in for a treat. We have the Sales Maven with us, Nikki Rausch. She's also the first podcast guest ever from Boise, Idaho. So you're a double winner. You're a Maven and you're from Boise. Nikki, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today.
Thank you for having me. I love being a first, so I'm delighted. Thank you.
Nikki, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Yes. So, out of a college project, I got my first professional sales job, and I had my career as a professional salesperson traveling all over the country. And I was a traveling road warrior for many years, working at the manufacturer level, selling technology, and had a lot of success there. And eventually found my way to neurolinguistic programming. I was studying that. I know you've had some NLP experts on your show before. I was studying NLP with this idea that it would help me with sales, and it certainly did, but it actually allowed me to become a much better communicator. And I found that it was improving a lot of areas of my life, not only in the business side, but also in my personal side. And after having many years in a sales career, I got curious on what else was out there for me and eventually found my way into my own business, which is Sales Maven. I'm a sales trainer and coach. I started that business now. I'm coming up on my 12th year in business with this idea that I wanted to make a bigger impact in the world. And I found that the skill set that I had learned, how to have strategic conversations and make selling easier, was something that I could translate into skills and teach other women how to do so that they could make a bigger impact in their lives and their communities. And so that's what I do now.
Nikki, one of the reasons I was so excited to visit with you was on one of the topics you've touched on, the NLP. I am starting to explore that as a podcaster.
Mm,
And what does NLP, or what rather sort of the concepts from NLP, tell me and teach me about not simply an effective way to communicate, but something that will really move my audience to want to come back. And I mentioned to Nikki before we started the requirements for this podcast, most importantly was to have fun. And what I have found is when I have fun, the guest has fun, but even people listening on an audio format can tell. And we communicate that with our voices. And
absolutely.
that when the guest and host are having fun, it makes the audience experience more enjoyable. And that should be intuitive to anyone who's ever had a conversation, basically. But it's something that I don't think podcasters have really focused on enough. So that was one of the things I wanted to maybe visit with you a little bit about, but of course, wrapped around what you've got going with the Sales Maven. So how do you help someone understand to simplify the selling process or the entire process you teach?
Yeah. So I found, and this comes from my background in neurolinguistic programming, and we'll see if you can apply this in the podcast too, is that there's a presupposition that there is a structure to excellence. And when somebody understands the structure of how somebody is achieving exceptional results in some area of their life or business, and they can take that structure and implement it into their own life or business, they can start to see similar results. So, knowing that from my NLP background, I found that as I started coaching people on how to have more strategic sales conversations, that if I could give them a framework, a structure that they could follow, then it took the scary, the icky out of sales, and it made it so that their own individual personality could shine through, and they would know, where am I in this conversation and what's the logical next step? So I teach a 5-step framework to a successful sales conversation. I call it the selling staircase. I wrote my 3rd book around it. And the reason, again, that it's this really simplified process and structure is because most people understand that on a staircase, for instance, you ascend a staircase one step at a time. You don't start at the bottom and hop all the way to the top step because that's a little unrealistic. And if you try to ask somebody you've never met before and don't have a lot of rapport with to hop up there with you, they're going to look at you like you're a little crazy. They're going to look at you like, no, thanks. I might bang my shins. I don't think I'm going to do that. But if you understand this one step at a time process of a sales conversation, It makes it easier for you and also for the buyer to know what to do or say next in the conversation so it flows more smoothly. So, the selling staircase is my 5-step framework.
So, what are some of the misconceptions about sales and how do you shift that mindset for success?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that sales is something you do to another person. And I teach that sales is something you do with another person because the doing something to somebody feels manipulative and frankly, it feels a little gross. And this is a lot of times why business owners tend to shy away from wanting to see themselves in a role of being successful at sales because nobody wants to be seen as manipulative and pushy and gross. So when you start changing the conversation, that this is a with conversation, and that truly is what it is. It's not me talking at you. It's not me word vomiting my feeds and speeds all about my product to you. It's finding out, do you have a need? Do I have a solution that can match that need? And do I have your permission to put it in front of you? And that can all transpire in a really simple conversation. And it takes that kind of scary out of it and takes the ick out of it for the buyer as well.
How do you build a relationship around something that I'm going to characterize is transactional? And how do you develop a relationship where you become, if not a trusted partner, at least someone that a customer or potential customer will come back to and engage with on a go forward basis?
First and foremost, the foundation of everything I teach, and this comes from my background in neurolinguistic programming as well, is that it's built on rapport. So again, if you don't have rapport with somebody, you really shouldn't be selling to them. So even if it feels like it's transactional, it's a one and done instance. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't like being treated like I'm a big wallet just walking around and having somebody just be like, I'm just trying to get into your wallet and take something out of it. Like, we're people. And even if you're selling to large organizations or if you're selling to an individual, you're still selling to a person and you need to relate to them as a person and treat them with the same kind of respect that you would treat anybody in any other situation. So it's not, again, it's not about doing things to somebody, it's about with. And I kind of mentioned this before that there's these three categories that need to happen. They need to have a need or a want. They you need to have a solution that meets that need or want. And the third most important thing is that you need to have permission. You really shouldn't be selling to somebody if you don't have permission to sell to them. So once you've got permission, there's some relationship implied there.
What's a discovery call and what's the importance of an effective discovery call in your sales process?
So discovery call and discovery is a lot of people refer to this as the consultation or maybe even the sales call. And I actually don't care what you call it. What I care is what you do in it. And that's step 3 of the selling staircase, by the way. And the intent of a successful discovery call is to find out those 3 things that I said. Do they have a need? Do I have a solution? Do I have permission to put in front of them? And to be successful in a discovery call, there's a couple things that have to happen. One is you have to create safety in the mind of the buyer. And the way that you can create safety with somebody is do what I teach is called a pre-frame. So it's essentially letting the person know kind of what's the purpose of the call, what's going to happen in the call, so that they feel prepared. Because that may seem a little odd of like safety. Like, why do I need to create safety? I'm the person who's nervous. I'm the seller. In actuality, people who are willing to give up their time and their attention and give energy to a conversation with you, they want to know that they're not going to be shamed into something, that they're not going to feel uncomfortable, that you're not going to just be pushy. So when you can pre-frame at the start of a call what's going to happen, it like it like calms the water. So the other person knows, okay, I know what's going to happen here and I'm in charge. Like I get to decide how far I want to go in this conversation.
So, what are some key techniques to positioning yourself? Is this as a solution provider? Is this as a trusted provider? Is this a relationship where it goes beyond simply the transaction? How do you really position yourself to be a solution, but be a solution on an ongoing basis?
There's a little bit of a nuanced answer to this because you really want to tailor your approach to what's most interesting and useful to the person you're in conversation with. And the way that you do that So you'll know and set yourself up for success and long-term relationship with somebody is by asking really smart questions. Now, in the discovery process, I teach that there are two types of questions that you should be asking. There's the right fit questions. That's to help you identify, again, do they have a need? Do I have a solution? And then the second type of question is what I call your expertise questions. And those establish you as the expert, as the trusted partner, as somebody who knows something or has something that is going to help solve a problem or meet a need for this person. So your expertise questions are crucial. And the difference between asking an expertise question and what most people do is instead of me showing up and being like, "Hey, Tom, look at me. I'm a really big deal. Here's all my accomplishments. I did this. I did that. I've done this. This people have bought from me." Like people go, "I don't care, Nikki. Like I don't really care that much about you yet because I don't know if you can solve my problem." But if I can ask expertise questions that establishes me as an expert and gets you thinking about what does that answer mean to me? Why is she asking me this question and how am I going to use this information? And oftentimes it plants seeds in the mind of the buyer to go like, "Oh, I hadn't really thought about that," or "Oh, huh, I should probably be thinking about how I could bring this into my business or into my life to find some solution." So when you start to do that, when you start to be seen in the mind of the buyer as the expert, as the resource, as somebody who spurs good thought for them, of course they're going to want to have long-term relationship with you.
One of the things that I have often seen entrepreneurs, corporate officials, and really anyone in business struggle with is scale, particularly when they're very good at something. And if they're very good, unfortunately, they tend to get promoted.
Yes.
And so they have trouble communicating what may be innately inside them or what they have learned that made them very good to their team. How do you help the person who's the really superior salesperson, who's really created something special and is able to sell it, but now is ready to take the next step and bring a team in and scale up? How do you really don't not I think they understand they need that conversation, but how do you walk them through that process?
One of the things I do when I'm training teams is when I'm talking to the leader is it's important that the leader starts to see anybody who is client facing, anybody who interacts with your client on some level, whether it's in a sales role or whether it's just your assistant even. They have the opportunity to either build deeper rapport and connection or break that rapport and damage that relationship, right? I was having this conversation earlier today with a client, and we were talking about how if you go into a place of business and you get really bad service, you don't say, "Oh, I'm only going to go back to that place of business when Debbie isn't working." You say, "I'm never going back to that place of business again," right? Because it's about the experience of being there and it's not specific to the person who gave you the bad experience. So that means you got to train your team. You have to train them to recognize and act on buying signals. This is something I spend a lot of time talking about. You have to train them to create curiosity in the mind of the buyer about what's possible for them, what else is there. Because, you had mentioned earlier about long-term client relationships. And in order to scale your business, if you're constantly looking for that next client that like I have to like churn through clients as fast as possible to get to the next one, you're gonna have a really hard time scaling. But if you can start to increase lifetime value of your clients, now scaling gets much easier because you've already built relationship with these people. They already know and trust you. They're much more likely to buy the next thing you have to offer. But if you're not the person who's interacting with them and having that client facing those conversations, then the person who is has the opportunity to increase the lifetime value of that client by creating curiosity, recognizing buying signals, offering opportunities for this client of what else is possible for them.
Many of the listeners to this podcast are in the corporate world, and I can't wait to get this pod in front of them and say, "You wanna know how to do it? This is how you do it." And frankly, one of the reasons, this is gonna go up on a podcast called Innovation and Compliance, and although the word compliance is in the title, it's really about innovation. And what I try to do is bring innovative strategies, tools, and techniques from outside the compliance arena to the compliance arena, Because in the corporate world, the customers of a corporate compliance officer are the employees. And a lot of compliance professionals are a lawyer like me, and that's not something that we were ever taught to deal with. So I'm really excited to hear you talk about these strategies because I see a direct correlation to the corporate world and how a law department, a general counsel, a chief compliance officer, a compliance professional can use exactly what you said. And I'm going to pick on the word curiosity because we talk about that as a skill that every compliance officer must have, but I've never heard it in the way you phrased it, which is around the curiosity of what your customer is saying, the curiosity to listen. And listening is a key skill for any corporate officer. So this is very cool.
Thank
Now we're
you.
going to turn to one of my favorite subjects. I have two
Okay.
favorite subjects, compliance and podcasting.
Okay.
Turn to podcasting because I am a huge proponent of the podcast format for hosts, for guests, and everyone in between. So I want to started by asking you, how do you see the power of podcasting as a lead generation tool? And then I'll tell you what I see it as.
Okay. I'm going to say that I started guesting on podcasts back in 2017, I think was the very first one. By 2018, I realized, wow, this is a game changer as far as all the marketing dollars I'd spent in all the different arenas. Being on a podcast as a guest has the best long-term return on investment. And the reason for that is because podcasts are evergreen. And somebody might discover your podcast a year from now. And the thing about podcasts is when you find one of those podcasts you love, you tend to binge it, right? Just like how we now binge our shows, right? Like we want to consume. So people will go back and they'll start listening from the beginning of your podcast and they'll hear all these, great guests that you've had, these topics that you've put out there. They get that know and trust with you because they get to hear you in their ears. And so the idea of evergreen is such an important piece from building. And I still get new subscribers to my email list every single month from podcasts that I was on 2 years ago, 4 years ago, and ones that I was on 2 weeks ago. So to me, it's one of the best lead generation out there. And it gives people this idea of they get to hear you. Sometimes if there's a video component, they get to see you. And it's the people show up all the time to work with me, hire me to do a strategy session, and we get on a Zoom call together and they say, "Oh my gosh, it's so weird talking to you, Nikki, because you've been in my ears for the last 2 years," or however long they've been listening. And you're just like how you are on the podcast, which sends this like trust value of, oh, I can trust Nikki because I actually already feel like I know her. So that's my thought around podcasting. One of my thoughts, I'll say I love podcasting.
So, what are some of your best practices for turning listeners into clients? You touched on the email list. Does it start with that, or is it that plus?
I'm going to say actually it starts with the stories that you tell on podcasts. So whether you're a guest or whether you're the host, being able to relate it back and give real world examples in story form, because they say story is the language of the brain. And stories are memorable because they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when you can tell a story, the thing about story is it it cements itself in the mind of the listener if they find some relevance to that story to them. What I don't know, if have you heard that term before? People always say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Have you heard
Sure.
that? Okay. So there's another one where they say a story is worth 1,000 pictures. So if you can bring story into the podcast, people oftentimes repeat stories back to me. They change the context of them. Oftentimes they have they have details in the story that I told that I actually, if you listen to it, I never inserted those details. They insert them because stories matter and people remember story.
I'm writing that down. So,
Oh, good. I love that you're writing it down. I feel like I got a win right there, everyone.
so I have always been fascinated by the audio component of podcasting because, like you, I've had many people say something along the lines of, "I recognize your voice. I recognize your voice." And I had thought that it was simply the audio component. But I was at a podcast conference last week where a woman made a presentation on the four quarters of the brain and the different chemicals released. For instance, dopamine, fight, forgot a chemical around PTSD. What causes PTSD is you've had such a traumatic event, it's burned into your brain. So if it ever happens again, you know what to do. And she explained how the storytelling could allow you to activate those and people would remember them more. So I've signed up her for a podcast to further explore that. But there is something about the audio format that you're absolutely spot on. People will trust you more.
Yeah.
And I'm going to flip it now because I tell people that hosting the podcast will be the greatest lead gen tool you have ever used for the following reason. I might send you an email and say, my name is Tom Fox. I'm the compliance guy. You need compliance. I'd like to call you up and tell you what I do. And you may or may not respond. If I mail you and say, I'm Tom Fox, I have this compliance podcast. I want you to come on my podcast and talk about you. I get 100% response. And it's always yes. And
Of
it
course.
allows me to develop a relationship with you. And so I see podcast hosting as one of the best lead generation tools you can ever have. And you can start at a CEO or you can go down to the shop manager. They all want to be on a podcast because they all want to talk about them. That's one of the reasons I find podcasting so powerful. Can you tell me a little bit about your podcast experience?
I mentioned I first guested back in 2017, I think. And then by 2018, it was a real focus in my business. And then what happened was people started saying to me, "Oh, Nikki, I binge you on podcasts." And I was like, I don't have a podcast. How can you binge me? They're like, "Oh, I just go into my Apple podcast app and I just search your name, Nikki Rausch." So in 2020, I launched my podcast, but I launched it with a very specific outcome in mind. Is I launched it with this idea that it wasn't about me interviewing people to get potential clients, which I love that's how you're using yours. For me, it was about giving people an idea of what it's like to coach with me because it takes that scariness of, oh, a sales coach, is she gonna push me? Is she gonna shame me? Is she gonna make me do things that make me feel uncomfortable? All those hesitations that people have around sales coaches. So I started it with solo episodes. So that's me teaching because I love to teach a concept. And then I started doing on air coaching calls. So people would get an idea of what it's like to coach with me. And then I started doing sales success stories because then people could share, oh, I use this technique and here's what happened in my business. And it gives people that inspiration. So those three formats of the podcast have really worked well to drive people to take that kind of first step with me as far as whether they're signing up for my group coaching program, which is the Sales Maven Society, or if they're hiring me for a strategy session, or maybe they just decide, okay, I'm going to like read her books. But it really kind of helps kind of take that scary of, so when they show up, they're like, oh, this is just Nikki. I feel like I already know her and I can just talk to her. I don't even have to worry about saying stuff to her because I already feel like I trust her. I can just be candid and here's what's going on for me and here's what I need help with.
So there's 5 reasons to start a podcast. You have talked about 3 of them. One is to build that client potential customer relationship. The one you just articulated is audience engagement. And you're able to engage with your audience through the podcast so that you can then convert them, number 3, into a sales thought leadership. You are portraying yourself as a thought leader. And the other reason, which you're going to find out after you're on my podcast, is content creation, because I create nearly 20 pieces of social media sharing materials per podcast. So it's a huge content creation machine. And not only do I use that on my podcast and my network, that's a major marketing point for me
Yes.
is that content creation. So there's multiple reasons here. Nikki, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if anyone wanted to connect with you, what might be the best place or places to go? And then what would be your preferred social media channels, your website? And you've told us you have a deal for us for those listeners on the podcast. So give us a little taster of that.
Okay. I actually have it's a gift for your audience. So I have a training that I normally charge for, but I want to gift it to anybody listening who would find value in it. It's called Seal the Deal, and it really dives deep into those two types of questions that I mentioned in the discovery. This idea of your ideal fit questions and your expertise questions. So I'm going to gift that to your audience. And the way that you'll get it for free is if you go to yoursalesmaven.com/compliance. It's gonna take you to a page, it'll already have the coupon code at the very bottom inserted, so you just register for it, and that will be my gift to you, and you can go through that training. That's a good way for us to get connected, and that's training that you can immediately implement into your business if you're having any kind of consultation calls at all. And then if you wanna be connected, I have my own podcast. It's called Sales Maven. So obviously your listeners like a podcast, come check out mine if the message that I've given today resonates with you in some way. And I tend to hang out the most on Instagram, but you can also find me on LinkedIn.
What about your books?
The books are available on Amazon. You can search by Nikki Rausch and you'll find my 3 books there. The one I usually recommend for people if you're interested in selling is The Selling Staircase. That's the most comprehensive sales book. And if you're just really interested in the NLP stuff, I have a book called 6 Word Lessons on Influencing with Grace. It's a very fast, easy read that gives you 100 lessons around NLP and how to apply those into your different relationships and the way you communicate.
I'm going to do another first on this podcast. In addition to our first guest from Boise, Idaho, I'm going to sign up for your training course. And I hope any listener who does so will contact me so we can do a podcast about your training course because I can't wait. Nikki, I have had so much fun. I have learned so much. I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thanks for having me.